Welcome to what I would call the flu edition of the Post-Gazette live show. Let me just say I'm Paul Zeise as always, and I will tell you that this week has been brutal. If you're out there suffering with the flu, like I'm trying to get over here, God bless you, boy. This one knocked me out, but hopefully we can do a whole lot here of catching up because a lot has gone on as I've been down and out for the count. Some of you probably right now are watching the Notre Dame-Georgia game. Obviously, yesterday was an interesting day in our country's history. The game had to be postponed because of what went on in New Orleans. But overall, to be honest, overall, the college football playoff just really hasn't been all that exciting, has it? The Arizona State game was good. Obviously, it was kind of fun. The Arizona State-Texas game, and, I thought that game was fun. But for the most part, most of these games have been brutal to watch. And so hopefully this Notre Dame game is much better than it was, much better than some of these other games have been. Penn State obviously has handled business like we thought they would. And, of course, I think that's the key when it comes to all of this stuff is there is at least one local tie to the playoffs. Now let's get back to the NFL, which is what we are usually heavily discussing here with respect to the Steelers. Now, first things first, I get a lot of people want Hines Ward and James Harrison to be Hall of Famers. And quite frankly, I don't necessarily think that either of them would be out of place in the Hall of Fame. But I also don't know that that's necessarily this great outrage that neither of them are in. I look at Hines Ward, and one of the problems that Hines Ward is going to have, and I think that he's got a resume that you can make a lot of cases for, but one of the problems that Hines Ward is going to have is from this point forward. Every receiver that's going to be entering eligibility is going to probably have better numbers than him just because of the way the game has changed. And the further that he gets away from his career, I think the less people are going to remember the fact that he is, he was a guy who was a great blocker and all that other stuff. So to me, I think it's going to be tougher and tougher and tougher for Hines Ward to make the case that he should be in the Hall of Fame. I think he's going to be a guy who'll get in, the same way that Bill Cowher and Donnie Shell and some of these other guys did, where there was, a veterans committee down the road that put some guys in that didn't get voted in. But in terms of getting voted in, there's a few things that are going to be going against Hines Ward, unfortunately. And, I don't necessarily know what is the right decision when it comes to Hines Ward. I just know that I've consistently thought that he probably is just on the outside looking in. But the number of old school reporters, guys that have covered the league for a lot of years, those guys that have the votes, a number of those guys are starting to retire. That's going to hurt Hines Ward because you're going to have a lot of younger, newer guys who are all obviously going to be in a place where they they're going to be in a place where they're going to have a lot of recency bias. And so, those guys are probably not going to give the benefit of the doubt to Hines Ward for right or wrong. It's just reality. And like I said, you're going to start to see guys like Larry Fitzgerald that are going to become, eligible, and some of these other guys like that have just retired. They're going to become eligible. And then all of a sudden, when those guys become eligible, it's going to be harder and harder and harder for Hines Ward to find a spot to make it into the Hall of Fame the traditional way. I believe that he will make it there. I think he'll be a guy that probably will make it there, down the road, but, via a different avenue. But I don't think he's going to do it right now. And I think that's the key here. I think the other guy, James Harrison, to me, James Harrison was a great, great player for a very short period. I go either way with him. I could go the Terrell. There are people that want to go the Terrell Davis or not. Terrell Davis. Terrell Davis, that's his name, right? The running back from the Broncos, who had basically 4 years where he was really good and made it into, yes, Terrell. I don't know what was going on in my head, but yes. I mean, you could make that argument for James Harrison, but to me, James Harrison has probably a weaker argument than Hines Ward. Hines Ward's got a number of things you can point to and say, this should put him in the Hall of Fame. I don't know that I think that it's the greatest outrage that he's not in, but I understand why he isn't. James Harrison, I don't know that he's going to make it in ever. I think that when people think of James Harrison's career, there's just not enough beyond, a few years where he was unbelievable. Great story, by the way. Overcome a lot, a guy that was cut a bunch of times and guy that, wouldn't quit, and a guy that, fought his way to become one of the best defensive players in the league for a few years. I get all that. But, when it comes to the Hall of Fame, I just don't know that James Harrison has quite enough. So, neither one of them were named semifinalists. I know people or finalists, I'm sorry, and people were really upset about it. Hines Ward seems to be the one that people are more upset about, but I don't think it's a conspiracy. I just don't think it's a conspiracy against the Steelers in any way. I just think it's one of those things where Hines Ward plays a position where the game has changed a lot in the last 15, 20 years. The guys that are going to be retiring now, that are going to start being on these lists, are all going to be guys that have better numbers than Ward just because the game is different. And, all the stuff we remember watching Hines Ward play, they become a little bit more of a distant memory. The fact that he was this great, unbelievably outstanding blocker and all that stuff, it just becomes something that is, I would say, secondary as we get further and further away from his career. And the number of people will start to look more and more at his numbers, which are pretty good, by the way, especially his postseason numbers. But they will start to compare just his numbers and not really the player. I just think it's going to be a really difficult climb for Hines Ward from this point. I thought his best chance to get in was his first couple of years. And by the way, it was pretty cool to watch him coach. Arizona State almost pulled off an incredible upset. Actually, I don't know that it would have been that much of an upset watching that game. But Hines Ward, as you know, is the receivers coach for Arizona State. And I got to be honest with you, I thought that team played their ass off. I was really impressed with just the way. And to be honest with you, the way that Arizona State played, there were two guys on that sideline that kind of embodied the spirit. The first was Jake the Snake Plummer. I mean, the original Arizona State guy, right? Jake the Snake Plummer. And I think that, the way that he played with reckless abandon and just kind of balls to the wall, that's how that Arizona State team played yesterday. And guess what? Hines Ward, the receivers coach, same thing, man. That team played with the spirit. Okay, of Hines Ward and Jake Plummer. I felt like they deserved a better fate. Didn't happen. Texas won. Congratulations to Texas. They move on. But at the end of the day, what I saw from Arizona State was a whole lot of Hines Ward and a whole lot of Jake Plummer. But nevertheless, the Steelers now play on Saturday. And there has been this question about whether or not the Steelers should play everybody and play to win this game if the Ravens win at 4:30 or whatever. What is it, 4 o'clock and 8:30 or 4:30 and 8, whatever time the games are. The Ravens play before the Steelers, and it's highly likely that the Ravens play the Browns, I think the Browns are starting Bailey Zappi. It's very clear to me that the Ravens are going to win this game. If you ask me, and this is just a side here, but these week 18 games or 17 or whatever we're going to call these games, if I'm the Browns, isn't there some responsibility to try and win the game? And if you're going to try and win the game, doesn't that mean playing your best quarterback, which is Jameis Winston? I mean, yeah, it's highly likely that he could throw 5 interceptions against the Ravens. But you know the other thing is, he could also beat them like he did the first time. Like, he's the one guy you have in your quarterback room that gives you an opportunity, perhaps, to win this game. So to me, the Browns, it's one thing to say, well, they're not obligated to the rest of the league. They're not, but they are. At the end of the day, you know what? Bailey Zappi is not, part of your future, nor is Dorian Thompson-Robinson. So it's not like you're trying to get, an extra look at these guys, or you're trying to get more, reps for these guys or any of this crap. To me, the guy that gives you the best opportunity to win is Jameis Winston. So you should be playing Jameis Winston. Period. I don't understand exactly why you wouldn't. Yep, I know he turned it over the last time he played and things didn't go very well and all the other good stuff. I get it. But by the same token, he gives you the best chance to win. These other guys are stiffs. I expect the Ravens will have their starters out of the game midway through the third period, their third quarter. Because it just seems to be one of these games where Lamar Jackson will line up, he'll throw a couple touchdown passes, Derrick Henry will run for a couple touchdown passes, it'll be 28-0. They'll be on the sidelines laughing and yucking it up, getting ready for their playoff game. And the Browns, Stefanski will still be trying to score a touchdown with Bailey Zappi or whatever his name is. I mean, it's ridiculous. Nevertheless, if they win that game, there is a good discussion about, well, should the Steelers rest? I mean, like a guy like TJ Watt, if he's banged up, or some of these guys that have these bumps and bruises, should they rest them? And I would say this. The game, if they lose, if the Ravens win, the game will mean a lot to the Steelers still. Because it'll be the difference between playing in Houston or in Baltimore in the first week of the playoffs. And you know what? I know that the Steelers have had some success against Baltimore, but I'll be honest with you, I don't know, based on what I saw the last game, if I think the Steelers want to play Baltimore right now. Especially when it comes to the fact that they have an opportunity to play a Texans team that I just think is just not very good. I mean, they're limping to the finish line. They're a team that basically is going to win their division because their division isn't very good. I think C.J. Stroud has sort of taken a few steps back. I look at it and basically say it is important for the Steelers to know that they need to win this game on Saturday against the Bengals. Even if the Browns win, because it makes a much easier road in the first round of the playoffs. I mean, honestly, I feel like this. I feel like if the Steelers lose on Saturday, they're likely to lose their next game. And if they win on Saturday, they're probably likely to win their next game as well because they're going to be playing the Texans. It's really that important. I mean, it's simplified, but it's true. You'd rather play the Texans in Houston than Baltimore, the Ravens in Baltimore. And I don't care what your record is against Baltimore. I just don't, because I think that the reality is, based on what we saw the last game, I don't know that there's any way that you could sit here and tell me that you think right now, if the Steelers went and tried to play in Baltimore again, that you would feel really good about them winning. I'm not saying they wouldn't, I'm not saying they wouldn't necessarily lose. That's not at all what I'm saying. They very well could win in Baltimore. We've seen it before. We've seen them do it. I get it. But I don't know, man. It feels to me like in the last 3 or 4 weeks, Baltimore has played a hell of a lot better than the Steelers have played. And it feels like Baltimore has sort of found itself in where it needs to be. And so I think that's, to me, the team you want to avoid. In fact, I think you'd rather play at Buffalo than at Baltimore right now. I don't know that that's necessarily what everyone else is saying. And I think that that's one of those things where it is important to note who's playing well right now. I would much rather play against a team like Buffalo, who's had some real issues with their defense recently, who, again, we talk about MVP, Josh Allen has to carry way too much of the load up there. And when you have one guy that has that much of the load to carry all the time, guess what happens? If he has a little bit of a bad game or a little bit of a down game, or you're able to, contain him a little bit, you beat them. So I'm just saying, to me, if you ask me, if I had to rank where you want to play, in terms of playoff games for the Steelers, I'll tell you this. First, I think the Steelers their best matchup would be playing the Broncos at Heinz Field, obviously. That would be their best matchup. The second, their second best matchup, I'm sorry, I'd much rather go play the Texans in Houston than play the Chargers at home. Even though I think they would beat the Chargers, I think the Texans are an easier game than playing the Chargers, because, the Chargers, I think, are very well coached. I think they play really, really fundamentally sound. They don't beat themselves. They've got a quarterback who's good enough. They could be a little bit scary. Then after that, I would say your next choice would be obviously playing in Buffalo, then in Baltimore, then, of course, Kansas City is the place where you don't want to play. So I think when I look at this game that's coming up, I think it's very, very important, honestly, for the Steelers to win this game against the Bengals. So, I never, ever thought that there would be this thing where they might sit some guys, just from the standpoint of it didn't make sense, because there's still something on the line, even if the Ravens lose. I mean, even if the Ravens beat the Browns, there's still something on the line for the Steelers. Now, what they also need to do, here's the other thing. Somehow, some way, we've now managed, and of course, this is what happens when you have 24-hour, talk radio, talk podcasts. You have, all these different outlets that are going all the time. Television, the national guys, the national hot take shows. You have so much time to fill that now all of a sudden things that are silly become accepted. And the newest one is that somehow, that this Bengals team is really going to be scary for the Steelers. I'm not saying that the Bengals aren't capable of beating the Steelers, but they still have a horrible defense, number one. They lost one of their two most important offensive linemen. Their running back is hobbled. So basically what we're talking about is you're thinking is that Joe Burrow and two receivers are going to be good enough to beat the Steelers by themselves in Acrisure Stadium. I'm sorry, I just don't see it. I don't think, in fact, I know that the Steelers are underdogs. To me, this game feels to me like the Steelers win, and probably win going away. I could see this being something like the Steelers win like 37-21 or something. And I just think that we're talking a little too much about the Bengals and not really talking about the Bengals' deficiencies right now in all the different ways that they're hurt and they're beat up and they're banged up and they're one-dimensional. And, again, their defense stinks. I'm just telling you, I think that people are talking themselves into this Bengals team is scarier than it actually is. If you look at who they've beaten, they really haven't beaten anybody good. So all I'm telling you is I feel like the Steelers are going to win on Saturday and then get a chance to go play against Houston next Sunday. The biggest thing for the Steelers is they cannot take any more injuries. Again, you can't rest anybody because you got to win the game. But they cannot take any more injuries. And they need to get Joey Porter Jr. 100%. Obviously, we've seen that. Dante Jackson looks like he's back at practice. So, hopefully he'll be 100%. What we've seen from the Steelers is they don't have a lot of depth when it comes to their secondary. They don't have a lot of depth when it comes to their defense in general. And, despite all of the moves they made in this offseason, they cannot take a few injuries on defense or a few more injuries or have a couple of key guys go down because their defense is very, very thin. Now, offensively, there are a lot of people that are worried about the Steelers. I get that. I understand that, okay? And I think that one of the biggest things with the Steelers is they went a couple of weeks without George Pickens. And then they also went a few weeks, right, where they were, trying to figure out what they wanted to be as an offense. I think it all comes together on Saturday. I mean, I think you've got George Pickens back healthy. I think that Russell Wilson, one of the things that we've seen from him, he's got to get better at throwing some of the intermediate passes and getting the ball out of his hands quicker. But that probably is something that will come now that he's got all of his weapons back and they're back in sync a little bit. I really think that one thing that the Bengals have been, listen, you can say whatever you want to say about the Steelers offense last year with Matt Canada and, with Arthur Smith and everything else. Guess what? One constant has been they've been able to put up big numbers against the Bengals. Why? Because the Bengals stink. Kenny Pickett threw for a bunch of yards against the Bengals last year. Mason Rudolph threw for a bunch of yards against the Bengals last year. So to me, this should be the perfect game for the Steelers passing game to get back on track. They should be able to really get the ball in the air and get back on track and everything else. I think that that's what we're going to see this game. I really do. But we'll see what happens. I mean, again, if they take an injury or two, it probably changes my thoughts about the Texans game. But I really believe that people have allowed the fact that the Steelers have gotten beaten up over the last couple of weeks, that they've gotten beaten up over the last couple of weeks. They've been playing the best teams in football. But I don't think that erases what they were able to accomplish the first 12 or 13 weeks of the season, or 14 weeks, or whatever it is. So I feel like we're getting way ahead of ourselves. I fully expect the Steelers to win on Saturday against the Bengals. And I'm going to say win probably kind of going away. 10 or more. I fully expect that because that's who they were, or that's who they were for most of the entire season, right? Until they had to play three of the best teams in football. I fully expect them to go beat the Texans as well. I do. It just is one of those things where you've got to sort of recalibrate a little bit. You got to take your mind out of the, gloom of what it is to be a Steeler fan. Honestly, I think that's the biggest thing. Sometimes Steeler fans get in their own head and they want to convince themselves that things are as worse than they are. They're not. Listen, they struggled a little bit. You know what? You know what I found out over the last 3 weeks? They're not as good as Baltimore. They're not as good as Kansas City, and they're not as good as the Eagles. But guess what? Most of the league isn't. I still think they're better than the other teams in the playoffs. I still think they're much better than the Bengals. And I think that's one of the things you've got to continue to be focused on. It's so hard for people, right, when the Steelers lose a few games to just understand, oh, my goodness, this team is really, going to fall apart now. Everything is, the sky is falling. Not really. Not really. So anyway, I got to be honest with you. I feel like this is going to be a lot of fun watching the Steelers play on Saturday, because I think that many of the things that, we've been worried about for 3 weeks, I think they're all going to come together. And I'm not usually one that's overly optimistic, but I really believe that the Bengals aren't very good, and they're going to help the Steelers sort of get back on track. Now, we do this every day at 5. Generally we go longer than this, but I'm coming back from the flu, and I got to be honest, I'm ready to lay down. I appreciate y'all joining us. We do this Post-Gazette live thing, and again, game is always on at Archie's. Get down to Archie's. Archie's on Carson Street, home of the 80-cent wings Monday through Thursday, home of the Paul Zeise grilled cheese sandwich. You can watch all the games at Archie's, and when you get down there, tell them I sent you. Let's do it again tomorrow. We'll talk more Steelers, talk college football playoff. We'll do it all again. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a good day.